Firstly, I would like to establish that I do not play horror games often. I do not hate the genre, simply do not play this kind of games often. So I'm not gonna compare Dead Space to other horror or horror survival games in this review. Dead Space is the first episode of the Dead Space trilogy, so I cannot compare it to the other two games since I plan to play them after this one. On the other hand, I cannot say that I do not know anything about the game either. Since it was released in 2008, I saw others play the game before, and because of that I knew the story beforehand and some degree what to expect. After this brief opening, let's get to the most important part, the gameplay and the technical solutions problems. During my time playing the game, I did not have any major problems like crashing or any major game-breaking glitch or bug. I only ran into one problem on New Game Plus. When picking up the first weapon, I was unable to do it because I did not have space for it in my inventory, and the consequences of me being unable to pick up the weapon was that during the first chapter my character could not stomp or punch. This problem fixed itself when I reached chapter 2. Other than this small bug, I did not have any other quote game-breaking technical problems with the game. Dead Space being an old game, I was a little worried about using Alt-Tab key combination, but luckily the game had no problems with it. Dead Space is a game that was clearly made for the consoles. In 2008, when the game was released, if my memory serves me right, console games was locked for 30 FPS, and Dead Space as well can only go up to 30 FPS on PC too. This is a bit disappointing but understandable, since it would have been difficult to change that for the PC version. On the other hand, the developers could have changed this for the PC version, but they did not. Maybe they did not have time or money, or was just lazy and did not care about the PC version. This is also not the only thing was not implemented well for the PC version. The game options are not extensive, but it has what is mostly needed. Mouse sensitivity, keyboard buttons customization, brightness, resolution, full screen, V-Sync, graphic quality, depth of field, motion blur, shader and shadow quality is just a few examples. The keyboard buttons customization are separated into three parts. First is the basic, these are when the players just walk around. Next is the aim, these are when the player aim with the weapon. The last rig, when the player using the inventory, map and other similar functions. I guess I'm gonna talk about the first and for me the only major problem of the game, and that is the mouse control. This problem is already noticeable in the game menu. The mouse is super sensitive. During actual gameplay this is even more obvious. The problem is changing the mouse sensitive in the options does not help much. The problem that the mouse is not just super sensitive but uses mouse acceleration, so at higher sensitivity it is more apparent that the cursor moves after the mouse already stopped. If someone reads up on this, they can find out that other than just mouse acceleration, there are problems with mouse lag, dead zones and low sensitivity, which means precise aiming in the game is pretty much impossible. I played the game without looking up any solutions, but I highly recommend for PC players who are not used to playing shooters with a controller to try out some of the solutions found on the internet for this problem. Again, I think this problem originates from the game being made for consoles, where the aim assist probably erases this problem. I think this lag is also applied to the movement of the character, because after letting go of the button, the character takes another 2 steps. However, this did not bother me after playing the game a little, unlike the mouse, which was a major disappointment and annoyance throughout the whole game. Also, the camera control is not very good either. All these problems originate from the fact that Dead Space was made for consoles and the PC version was just an afterthought. These were my problems with the game from a technical standpoint. Now let's talk about the gameplay and game mechanics. Dead Space has 3 difficulty in the beginning, easy, medium and hard. After finishing the game once, the impossible difficulty will be unlocked. The player character has 2 abilities, stasis and telekinesis. Both of these functions can be guessed from their name, but just to be sure, stasis is used to slow down enemies and objects. Telekinesis is used to pick up and throw objects. The player only has these 2 abilities, but both can be used to solve puzzles and attack enemies. As I said, stasis can be used to slow down enemies and slow down objects, for example malfunctioning doors. Telekinesis is used to move and throw objects at enemies or just to move them out of the way. Throwing normal objects at enemies only stagger them, it does not deal much damage. For dealing damage against enemies, explosives should be thrown at them. There are 7 weapons in the game. Other than those, the player can stomp and hit enemies. For me, hitting and stomping felt really useless. They felt more like last resort or only used on enemies which was slowed down with stasis. I use stomp mainly to open breakable chests where the player can find items. The 7 weapons namely are the Plasma Cutter, Line Gun, Pulse Rifle, Flamethrower, Ripper, Contact Beam and the Force Gun. Every weapon has 2 firing modes. The Plasma Cutter is the very first weapon that the player obtained and in my opinion probably the best one. The weapon fires an energy beam. It deals a lot of damage, it holds a decent amount of ammo, its reload speed and firing speed is pretty fast as well. The Plasma Cutter's alternate firing mode is not very interesting, it simply changes the weapon's firing method from horizontal to vertical. This is one of the weapons I use throughout the whole game. This weapon has a minor peculiarity, its firing mode resets to the default at the beginning of every chapter. Next is the Line Gun. I did not use this weapon during my playthrough, only tried it out on New Game Plus. Starting the game again, I would probably use this weapon. It is very similar to the Plasma Cutter. This one also sends out an energy beam, but a much wider one, and its secondary firing mode is a mine which after some delay releases laser beams around it. One of the other weapons I used was the Pulse Rifle. Considering how the Necromorph should be taken down, which I will speak about later, you would think it is a bad weapon, but I actually found it really good. This weapon pretty much just an assault rifle. In my opinion, this weapon has 2 disadvantages. One, it does not deal much damage, and second, which is somewhat connected to the first one, that it needs a lot of ammo, and that uses up important inventory space. I think its biggest advantage is that you can keep the enemies constantly staggered. The Pulse Rifle's secondary firing mode is firing bullets around the player, but I did not really use it. I found it a little useless because it does not deal much damage and you have to aim at the enemy's limbs, which you cannot do while using this firing method. I do not use it as a primary weapon, but it is really good for a secondary one. The next weapon, I used it as a heavy hitter during my playthrough. It was the Contact Beam. The Contact Beam is also an energy weapon. According to my observation, this weapon deals the highest amount of damage out of all the weapons in the game. Of course, that damage comes with a price. It needs to be charged before shooting. It takes a little longer to reload than other weapons and its magazine capacity is the smallest out of all the weapons. For all these disadvantages, the weapon can pretty much one-shot most enemies without even upgrading it. Its secondary firing mode is a shockwave around the player. I did not use the secondary firing mode much. The last weapon I used during my playthrough was the Force Gun. I used this weapon mainly for crowd control. The primary firing mode is a shockwave that knocks enemies back while dealing some damage, and the secondary mode is a grenade that sends out a shockwave around it when exploding. Force Gun can push away dropped items too, so it's better to look out for that. The last 2 weapons is the Ripper and the Flamethrower. The Ripper basically a circular saw that either uses telekinesis to hold the saw against the enemies or launch the saw at them. The Flamethrower is well a flamethrower. It can either be used as a normal flamethrower or as throwing flame grenades. Honestly, I did not really use them, just tried them out on New Game Plus, but these 2 weapons seem the least useful to me. If I really have to say, the worst weapon in the game is the Flamethrower. It does not deal enough damage and cannot stagger enemies reliable enough. However, none of the weapons are completely useless or unplayable, which gives the game another reason to replay it, so you can play through the game with a weapon that you did not use before. After discussing the various weapons in the game, let's talk about what aiming is like in the Dead Space. While aiming, movement speed is reduced. Also, weapons can only be reloaded while aiming, but it is not necessary to continue to aim until reloading is finished. So it can be a good idea to stop aiming after reloading started to evade enemies better. If the player aims while talking with other characters through the communication device, then the holographic video will not be shown. There is a flashlight in the game which turns on when the player aims. If I have to say, there is one oddity when aiming, that the player character is pretty flexible. I felt like Isaac's head could reach the ground if I wanted to. And as I said before, the mouse control is not very good, which obviously negatively affect aiming, and because at its core this game is a shooter, leave a negative impact on the gameplay. At the same time, the player can hold/use 4 weapons and they can be accessed from a weapons wheel. On the weapons wheel, weapons that do not have any ammo shown in red color. During my playthrough, I felt like the game gave me ammo to the weapons that I use most often or to the ones that are in the weapons wheel. There is an upgrade system in the game. The player can upgrade the weapons, the rig, the stasis module and telekinesis. To upgrade something, you need power nodes. Upgrading can only be done at benches. Upgrading pretty straightforward, just choose the node you want to upgrade. Not all nodes give something useful, some just there to reach others that do. The upgrade nodes for weapons can give, for example, damage, ammo capacity, reload speed. For the rig, they give either health or air for the vacuum parts of the game. For stasis, it is capacity and duration. For telekinesis, range. It's important to choose only a few things to upgrade because you will not find enough power nodes to upgrade everything. Also, upgrading something, especially if you upgrade it fully, show a clear difference in the game. The default plasma cutter takes at least 4 or 5 shots to kill a basic necromorph, but the fully upgraded one only needs 2. And just as with the weapons, because you cannot upgrade everything fully, there is another reason to replay the game. Now let's take a look at Dead Space HUD. There is not one, or more precisely not one, that is usually in games. There is no health bar somewhere in the corner of the screen, or ammo counter, or other method that usually used in games. All of these game mechanics are turned into something that is part of the Dead Space universe. I'm not gonna pretend that all of them make complete sense, but I really like the developers' creativity to do these things differently, and at the same time they work as well as the mainstream method. The first and probably the most noticeable is the health bar. The health bar is on the back of not just the player character, but all the other characters as well. Clearly, the usability of someone's health being displayed on their backs do not make much sense, because how the people themselves could easily check it when it's on their backs. As a game element, this is a very unique and creative idea to display the character's health to the player. The introduction of the health bar is very well done as well. It is just simply said by a character that the crew status is gonna be linked to the ship, and the health bar gets filled up. Lost health can be replenished using health packs. Health packs can be used with a button for quick use, for example if you are in combat or from the inventory. Using a health pack not just comes with a visual confirmation that your health is replenished, but with a sound effect just for healing. I really liked it that you can confirm that you healed yourself visually and with audio as well, because the camera and camera controls not the best in the game, and if you stand next to the wall you may not be able to see your health bar, so hearing the sound effect for healing can be really useful, reassuring. The amount of stasis and air you have are also displayed on the back of the character. The air amount displayed in seconds, but when the player character starts to run out of air, even his breathing gets ragged, heavy. On a side note, in the vacuum areas there is sound, but all of them much quieter. There are two ways to navigate in Dead Space, the map and the breadcrumb. The map is mostly what can be expected. It is a 3D holographic one. It shows the environment and the usable stations like store, safe station and branch. I found it a little hard to use, and the breadcrumb made it useless for me. I barely used the map during my playthrough. The breadcrumb is basically a compass, but much cooler and better. The breadcrumb shows the way to the next objective by emitting a holographic line towards it on the floor. The quest description can be found in the journal. The journal has two parts. The first one is a summary of the quests to do, and the second is what the main character was thinking at the time. In the second part, extra information can be found about the Dead Space universe. For example, it is written here what RIG is short for: Research Integration Gear. The available quests are blue colored, the ones that cannot be done yet because some requirements have not been met are red, and the quests that are done are green. This makes it easy to visually identify which quests are done, which comes next, and which are for later. Of course, usually only one quest is available, but sometimes there is one listed for to do after finishing the current one. The most game element / gimmick-like function in the game is the inventory, where the player can only hold a very limited number of items in their inventory, so it is possible to think about it as a holographic list or interface for items found in your pockets. Also, while the player uses the inventory, the game is not paused, making it more immersive, more believable to be part of this universe. Well, this is true for all functions, except maybe for the save station. In the inventory, every item goes to the same space, except for the quest items, the power nodes and the money. The inventory sorts itself, so the player do not have to waste time on it. Inventory space can be increased with buying new armor. There is 6 different levels of armor. The first 5 is basically the same armor, just each level changes its appearance to some degree, give extra armor and inventory space, while the 6th one, to my knowledge, only a cosmetic one with the same specification as the level 5 suit. The level 6 suit can only be unlocked with finishing the game once. If I have to say one negative thing about the inventory, is that the developers did not change the navigation icon in the inventory from console style to PC style. But this is such a minor thing, not even worth mentioning. After the inventory, let's take a look at the items. First, there is the med pack, which you probably already figured out, used for restoring the character's health. There is 3 types of it: small, medium and large. Next, there is the air can. It can be used in vacuum areas to refill the air of the character. There is two types, small and medium. Then there is the stasis pack, which can be used to recharge the stasis ability. Next is the different ammo types for the weapons. After that, the schematics, which used in the store to buy new equipment or items. Next are the semiconductors, and their only purpose is to sell it in the store for money. For last but not least, the power node, which was already mentioned in the upgrade section of this review. The power node has another use. It can be used to open some of the closed doors. It's not necessarily worth it to open them in regard the items that can be found in there, but the item's monetary worth collectively is usually pretty much at least as much as the power node's worth. The power node has a different highlight color compared to other items, probably because it is one of the most rare and useful items. Now that we took a look at the inventory and the items, let's take a look at the store. In the store you can clearly buy items and equipment and also sell them. The player can also store the items which are not needed at the moment in the store. You can unlock new purchasable items and equipment using schematics. Of course, the player do not have to figure this out on their own. There is a tutorial message about it, and the store's holographic interface also write it out. There are multiple saving mechanisms in Dead Space. Firstly, there is a save station. The player can manually save the game progress here. If I know right, these stations are the only in-game function where the game is paused while they are being used. Other than the save station, the player can save at the end of each chapter. This works the same way as the save station. The last one I know of is the autosave, which happens in the background. I did not even realize there is an autosave function until I died and the game loaded not to a save station. So even if you die and you did not save manually, the player do not have to start from the beginning of the chapter. So the game is pretty generous when it comes to saving. The enemies in the game are called the Necromorph. They are made from dead human bodies, so if you find a dead body, it's not just a set piece or set story or something, but a potential source of danger. The next time you come around the area, they may have turned into necromorphs, so you can make your life a little easier if you cut off their legs. The game scripted, so even if you take away the dead bodies or dismember them, they will be placed back to where they were, so they can be turned into necromorphs. But the game actually remembers what shape the dead bodies were in and put them back in their original position in the condition that the player left them. So if you cut off the legs of the dead bodies, the newly created necromorphs will not have any legs and they can only crawl towards you. The game is scripted and it is story oriented, so the enemies spawn at specific place and time. If someone played the game many times already, they will probably know which enemy will spawn, when and where. I do not really have a problem with that. However, I really appreciated it that the enemies not just spawn out in the open the moment the player walks past a certain point. Instead, the developers use the environment, the ship for that as well. The necromorphs usually come out from ventilation shafts. For me that made sense. Where else could they attack you from by surprise? Not just that makes sense, but you can look out for the ventilation shafts and be wary of them as potential source of danger. Of course, the player can figure this out on their own, but this information is in the audio logs as well, giving an extra layer of depth for the game, hearing how the ship crew while trying to survive, figuring out how the necromorphs operate. The necromorphs not just attack the player from ventilation shafts, but they can play that too. So when the player walks past them, they can jump at them. So the necromorphs have more than one way to do things. We told a lot about the necromorphs already, but how do you actually defeat them? Unlike how dead bodies / zombies should be taken care of by shooting them in the head, in Dead Space that does not work. Instead you have to dismember them, and the game do not hesitate to tell you that multiple times.
Shoot the limbs of enemies for extra damage.
This is Benson, Tram Engineering. We think we figured it out. Smith killed one. Listen, forget about shooting him in the body. You gotta cut off the limbs. Grab a cutter, anything like that. Cut him apart.
Isaac, be careful. Shooting them in the body didn't seem to work. Go for the limbs. Dismember them. That should do the job.
Conserve ammo by dismembering enemy limbs and doing extra damage.
As I said previously, the enemies are called necromorphs, but there are multiple types of necromorphs in the game. I do not know what their official names are, but I do not even care. This is just what I call them. I will introduce them mostly how you meet them in the game. First is the basic necromorph. This is the type you will meet most often in the game. The next one is a variant of the basic necromorph. the Metal Pants Necromorph. They are basically the same as the basic one, except they wear metal pants, so shooting them in the leg is not very effective. After these two comes the Crawler. You can probably guess that they do not have legs and they can only crawl. Well, they can jump too, so you can often find them in zero gravity environments. The next one is pretty fucked up. It's the Baby. Yeah, these are necromorphs that were turned from the bodies of babies. They are ranged enemies. After the Baby comes the Swarm. They are very small necromorphs, even smaller than the Baby. They attack the player in packs and jump on them. If they jump on the player successfully, then the player has to shake them off. Other than that, they can be taken care of easily. After meeting the previous types, you can finally meet the one who actually created them, the Turner. They are not very tough, but if you do not take them out fast, you can find yourself surrounded by a bunch of necromorphs. At the same time the player meets with the Turner, they meet with the Uber Necromorph too. The Uber Necromorph is pretty much the same as the basic, just have twice as much health. The next type of Necromorph is the Fat Necromorph. Their specialty is when you kill them, they can spawn a swarm. The next two types of necromorphs can be considered mini-bosses. First, the Behemoth. They are big, strong and fast. They can only be really hurt at 4 specific locations. If you manage to damage them, they curl up and can only be hurt from behind. The second is the Immortal. They look similar to the basic necromorph, but if you cut off their limbs, they regenerate after some time. They can only be killed using specific tools. The next one is not really an enemy, more of an objective. The Poison Breather. They cannot move or attack, they can only poison the atmosphere. The next one is the Bomber. Well, they are pretty much suicide bullets. They approach you, then blow themselves up. You can cut off their bomb arms and throw them at the enemies using telekinesis. The next one is the Wall Hugger. They cannot attack themselves. Instead, they throw out small tentacle enemies that shoot at the player like the Baby. The Wall Hugger can be killed by cutting the tentacle connecting them to the wall. The next is a variant of a previous one. It's the Uber Crawler. Just like the Uber Necromorph, the only difference between the Crawler and the Uber Crawler is the Uber one has twice as much health. Well, this is true to all of the Uber variants. The next one is the Dangly Boy. They are quite tall, and after dealing enough damage to them, they fall apart to smaller necromorphs. Next is the Speedster Necromorph. They are created from the bodies of dead soldiers. Their main characteristic is that they are incredibly fast. The next ones are the Uber Behemoth and Uber Baby. Just like the previous Uber ones, they have twice as much health. The final one is the boss enemy, the Hive Mind. From a game mechanic side, it is not a very entertaining or engaging or even challenging boss. You just shoot the obvious weak spots and keep strafing. If the player keeps moving sideways, the boss cannot land a hit. There are other mini-bosses, but they are pretty similar to the Hive Mind, where the players fight them using an environmental equipment like a turret. Like the part of Dead Space enemy management, that just because a new enemy was introduced, they will not roll at the player constantly. Other than the necromorphs, there is environmental danger too, like malfunctioning gravity plates, loose electric cable, meteors. There are quotes minigames in Dead Space like a turret section or playing space basketball or the shooting range. The space basketball and shooting range give the player rewards if they complete different challenges. For a game that was released in 2008, this looks good. Well, good maybe not the right word. Maybe it is more precise to say that it has a unique look, and the developer's attention to details makes Dead Space very memorable. Never once during my playthrough did I thought the game looks ugly. I was too immersed in the game. There is barely any cutscenes / cinematic screens in the game, everything is in-game, nothing is pre-rendered. I'm not against pre-rendered cinematics if they are really good, but I really liked in Dead Space that they did everything in-game at the same time made it look very cinematic. This awesome in-game cinematics and the fact that there is not many loading screens in the game, practically just at the end of each chapter, makes the game really immersive. The player constantly in the game, not decked out of it with loading screens all the time. I'm going to be honest and say that I do not think the game is that scary. Of course, in the beginning it was scary for me too, but after playing more and more and getting more and more weapons got the game less and less scary. I knew whatever come my way I can handle it. But I also appreciated that the game did not try to force a jump out of the player with constant jump scares or keeping the player in the dark constantly. So I clearly felt like there are not many jump scares in the game. Every encounter is built up and not just pop out from out of nowhere. Dead Space tried to keep the game scary by setting and maintaining the atmosphere. The holographic interfaces in the game are really good too. They changes according to the situation. Like if a door is closed or need a key, or if it's opened, or you want to open a door with a power node, it is the door holographic interface the one actually asking if you really want to do that. There are many more holographic interfaces like these in the game. The main factor to replay Dead Space is clearly to experience the story again and play the game with the weapons that the player did not reuse before or playing on a higher difficulty. I'm not gonna go into details about the story much, but there will be some spoilers. The player plays as Isaac Clarke, an engineer. Isaac is a silent protagonist. He and the crew of his ship, USG Callion, are on their way to locate and if necessary repair the mining vessel USG Ishimura. The Ishimura is a planet cracker. The ship's job is to rip out a part of a planet which is rich in mineral resources. The rest of the crew consists of 4 more people: Zach Hammond, Chief Security Officer, Kendra Daniels, Computer Specialist, and 2 red shirts. The moment they arrive in the planetary system last seen the Ishimura in, the Aegis system, they already see that something is not right with the Ishimura. They try to contact the Ishimura, but no response, so decide to board the ship. However, the Ishimura's auto-docking system is malfunctioning and causes their ship to crash land. The player only started the game 5 minutes ago and things already going sideways. After crash landing, Isaac and the rest of the crew decide to ask for help from the crew of the Ishimura. However, according to the game there should be crew in the dock, but there is no one around. Another bad sign. They reach the flight lounge, but the door to the tram station is locked. Isaac goes to open it, then a quarantine lockdown activates. The lights go out, the crew's a little confused, and then something jumps in the room from the roof, and well, at this point the 2 red shirts fulfill their duty.
In the room with us.
Jesus! Open fire! Open fire! Kendra, power! Kendra!
Come on.
So chaos already breaks loose and Isaac and the other 2 actual characters, Hammond and Kendra, start to run away. This was just the first 10-15 minutes of the game. After this, Isaac's main job is to keep the ship operational and find a way to call for help or escape. I liked it a lot that every task Isaac has to do during the game makes sense, like repair the tram system so they can travel around the ship, get the Ishimura's captain access code so they can use the computers, fix the ship's engines so they won't crash into the planet they are orbiting, activate the ship's asteroid defense system so when they go across the debris field created from ripping out a huge part of a planet, the meteors do not pierce a million hole in their hull. Fix the life support system so they will not suffocate, send out a distress beacon, fix the ship's communication system. All of these tasks make sense on the starship. They are not just random bullshit tasks, like pick X amount of item for some reason that actually has no impact on the story or the characters. I do not really want to go into more details of the story, but it is mainly about Isaac trying to survive, while doing that figuring out what the Necromorphs are and where they came from. The game or story is separated into chapters. In every chapter the player travels to a different area, but not necessarily to a new one. However, even if the story makes the player to return to an area explored before, it is not gonna look the same. Every chapter is basically about fulfilling, accomplishing a task that I mentioned before. The game is story oriented, so it is not a surprise that it is linear and scripted. The linear game design usually works better for story-centered games anyway. For me, it is not a problem, especially if a game has such a good story and universe as Dead Space. In conclusion, Dead Space is a really awesome game. If I played it on a console, I imagine it would be pretty much a 9 or 10 out of 10 game. But I played it on PC and the horrible mouse controls left a negative impact on my experience. It was not so bad to completely ruin the game for me, but it was a constant annoyance through the whole game. So if you play Dead Space on PC, look up some methods that makes the mouse controls at least a little better. I'm going to mention it since it's already in development. There's a Dead Space remake on the way. I did not see much about it, but I saw a few things and some of them left me a little worried. Like how the developers said they are making the game darker. For me, one of the good points of Dead Space was that it is not pointlessly dark. In the video where they showed the game, it was so dark you could barely see anything. I hope this remake version will have a better mouse control than the original. So I am optimistic about the remake, but that's about it. I will not be surprised if it destroyed what makes the original Dead Space so good. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video.